has laid out its defense policy and weapons purchases over the next 5 years. What are likely to be the international implications? And with the remarkable turnaround in relations between China and India over the past year, what have been the driving forces behind the strengthening of ties? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Liu Xin. Japan approved its new National Defense Program guidelines and midterm defense program on Tuesday, laying out its defense policy and weapons purchases over the next 5 years. One of the main focuses was the inclusion of wording that would allow for the retrofitting of an Izumo-class destroyer to give it aircraft carrier capabilities. But analysts have accused this move as running against Japan's pacifist constitution. The guidelines also cover issues of cyberspace, outer space and electronic warfare as part of Japan's plans to create what it describes as a multi-dimensional joint defense force. Just what intentions does Japan have to develop these capabilities? With a record high procurement budget of 27 trillion yen or $240 billion over the next 5 years, what might be the regional and international implications? I'm joined in the studio by Professor Cheng Xiaohe from the Department of International Politics at Renmin University of China. Professor Cheng, thank you very much for joining me. Now, traditionally, I understand that defense guidelines in Japan would be revised every 10 years, roughly, but since Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came into power in 2012, he has already revised the guidelines twice. The first time in 2013, now 5 years later, this was the second time revising these guidelines. Why such high frequency?
Yes, according to Japanese official lines, there's a number of reasons for these countries to do so. Number one, North Korea's nuclear and missile weapons pose unprecedented threat to these countries. And another reason, China's rapidly developed military modernizations. But I think that's just serve as quite convenient excuses. Underlying as the officials' excuses, there's a number of other things I think play a very important role.
For instance?
For instance, Japan's try to normalize its statehood at a quickened space. If this country want to become a normal state, acquire normal statehood, and Abe government need to acquire all kinds of military capability to defend so-called sovereignty, territorial integrity. And another reason the United States support, you see, is in 2015, the United States and Japan upgraded its military guidelines to strengthen the two countries' military ties, particularly expand Japan's military roles in its alliance with these countries. So the two things I think play important roles to facilitate such a kind of revisions of defense guidelines. By the way, I would like to emphasize next year Japan will host a number of the important diplomatic events, such as hosting the G20, and the old emperor will retire and the new emperor will come to power, and certainly the local elections will take place and Senate elections will also happen. So in order to avoid all kinds of diplomatic dispute and pave the way for the successful conventions of all the diplomatic events, and Abe's government need to do so a little bit early.
Okay, so that's why the timing is now. I'm joined via Skype from Japan by Professor Takesato Watanabe, a professor of media studies at Doshisha University, and also via satellite by Victor Teo, professor from the University of Hong Kong. Welcome to the two. Now, Professor Watanabe, one of the points that's drawing a lot of controversy, of course, about the new guidelines is the upgrading of Izumo, Japan's largest destroyer. Now, the planned upgrading is to enable Izumo to transport and launch F-35BS bombers. Some believe it has become a de facto aircraft carrier. What's your judgment? Professor Watanabe. Okay, it seems that he's not able to hear me at this moment. Professor Tail, let me go to Professor Tail joining us from the University of Hong Kong. What's your answer to that question, if you heard the question?
What's my take on the F-30, the Izumo being converted to an aircraft carrier?
Yeah. What do you think of it?
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes. I think it's... well, personally, I think the move to convert the Izumo into an aircraft carrier has been somewhat discussed in Japan for a while now, but I'm pretty surprised that it was done this quickly. In my opinion, I think it's a deviation. It's definitely a step away from the pacifist constitution, because the constitution currently allows only for certain kind of shall I say war making, defense arrangements in Japan. The conversion of the Izumo into an aircraft carrier is certainly a step away from the intent of the people who wrote the constitution, because an aircraft carrier is actually an offensive weapon. Currently, the Japanese Defense Ministry and the bureaucrats and of course the politicians, the neoconservatives in particular from Abe administration, are arguing that this is really just another adjustment in their defense policy, and that this move to convert the helicopter carrier into an aircraft carrier does not constitute an infringement or a deviation from the Constitution. However, I think this is a slippery slope, because the moment they can do this, it means that they could actually potentially build, say, 5 or 6 more helicopter carriers and convert them directly. So in that sense, Japan might, the category of aircraft carrier then thus becomes a defensive weapon.
I see.
So this is actually a slippery slope, and I think that definitely.
Okay.
Yes.
Professor Cheng, now on Wednesday, Japanese Defense Minister Takeshi Iwaya inspected the Izumo for the first time after he took office, and he told reporters there is no change in Japan's defense-only policy, and said the vessel will not be in continual service carrying fighter jets. So is this a smokescreen?
Certainly, it is a smoke screens, and it is by turning the Izumo's destroyer into aircraft carriers is a great step for Japan to break its constitutions, because the constitutions has imposed a number of the restraints on Japan's military capability and military development, and it's not the first time for Japan to break the constitution's constraints, but also in the past years, Japan has taken a number of measures, steadily violated its constitutions. For example, Japan's relaxed its military export, and Japan also regains collective security rights, and also Japan's military personnel fight in the faraway place, not just in its neighborhood. So there is a number of the reasons, a number of the examples that Japan's government set up and try to break all the kinds of the constitution's restraint to make this country a normalized statehood.
Yeah. Well, under the new guidelines, there are also revisions concerning, for instance, the setting up of a space army, if I'm correct, to boost Japan's self-defense capabilities in such new domains as outer space and cyberspace. Now, we know that the United States is also building, aiming by 2020, a space force. Japan is expected to finish it by 2022, and is said to use this space force to collect debris in space rather than for any other offensive or military purpose. Professor Tail, why has it become so fashionable to have such a space force, and what's the implication for the region in terms of security?
Well, personally, I think it's a diversion. It's to match up with what the Americans are saying, because Donald Trump has actually ordered the U.S. Air Force to create a space force. And in that sense, I think the Japanese don't want to be seen lagging behind. At the same time, I think they want to be seen supporting Donald Trump's initiative. However, if we look back in history, Ronald Reagan had the same thing when he was dealing with the Soviet Union. He initiated space-based weapons initiative. The Soviet Union actually tried to catch up with the US, and consequently, because of the strain it put on the Soviet economy, the Soviet Union, well, it's one of the big reasons why the Soviet Union broke apart. Now, in this respect, I think, but in today's terms, I think the cyber command is actually pretty valid, because other than space, there's a second command, there's the cyber command, and I think cyber security is very important to all modern war-fighting armies. And in that respect, I think the Japanese and the Americans are cooperating to try and stay ahead of the technological race with China.
Yeah.
So I think this is a big step forward.
Yeah,
in that
Professor
sense.
Tail, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to get some insight from our guest from Japan, Professor Watanabe. We have heard the retrofitting of the Izumo destroyer to be a de facto aircraft carrier. We've also heard of Japan's plan to set up a space defense force, although that is how it's called. And it's also in the new guideline that Japan will increase its military budget to reach $240 billion over the next 5 years. So what does that all mean for Japan's military alliance with the United States and for other countries in the region, such as China, such as DPRK, such as Russia? Professor Watanabe. Okay, let me go back to Professor Chung here. Your answer to the same question, please.
Yes, you see, and Japan's try hard to become a full-fledged power and acquire all kinds of military capabilities. I think that's will greatly fuel the arms race in these regions, and also do harm to the regional stability and peace.
Does it mean that Japan is going to have an even closer military alliance with the United States after these revisions?
Certainly, that would change the relationship between Japan and the United States a little bit, but nonetheless, United States will remain the dominant partners in such a kind of allied relationship with Japan.
How about the increased military spending? As I mentioned, $240 billion over the next 5 years. How much of an increase is that? Very briefly, Professor Chung.
Yes, you see, that would be a great increase by almost 8%. Over its current
levels, which is already quite high compared to the previous years.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Well, we're going to keep a close watch on the situation. Many thanks to my three guests, Cheng Xiaohe, Professor from the Department of International Politics at Renmin University of China, Professor Victor Tail from the University of Hong Kong, and still many thanks to Professor Takesato Watanabe, a Professor of Media Studies at Doshisha University. You have been watching The Point. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, I'll be showing you my previous recorded interview with a former Indian ambassador to China about improved relationship between the two countries. Stay with me. From being embroiled in a border skirmish to enhancing mutual trust and bilateral ties, China and India have witnessed a remarkable turnabout in their relations in just over a year. On the sidelines of the G20 summit in Buenos Aires at the beginning of December, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi said the two sides should deepen their cooperation on a number of fronts, including bilateral trade, poverty reduction, environmental protection, and cultural exchanges. Against the tide of protectionism that's been sweeping the global economy, she and Modi, along with other leaders from the BRICS bloc of nations, also issued a statement calling for open international trade and the strengthening of the World Trade Organization. So what roles are China and India playing in countering unilateral and protectionist measures? What encouraged the two countries to strengthen their ties despite their differences, and how has diplomacy between the two countries changed over the years? I talked to Her Excellency Nirupama Menon Rao, former Indian diplomat, foreign secretary and ambassador, which was also the first female ambassador of India to China.
It's wonderful to be back in Beijing. I have wonderful memories of my tenure here as ambassador of India.
Welcome back to the to CGTN as well. I know that during your tenure you were a frequent guest on then CCTV News. So we're going to talk about the differences that you observe over the past decade. But first, where are we in terms of bilateral relations between China and India? As I said, we had that unpleasant period of border disputes in Donglang or Doklam, whatever you call it. But now we're calling for greater mutual trust, cooperation and bilateral ties. Where are we?
First of all, I'd say it's a very welcome development that we have restored the equilibrium in bilateral relations. When you contrast it to the situation last year, in the summer of 2017, when we had the standoff, I would say, at Doklam, I think people on all sides, on both sides, were worried about the state of relations at that time. And this year, what you have seen is a very welcome attempt by both countries, by the leaders of both countries, to meet, to discuss these differences, and to really draw a blueprint for the way forward. And what you see as a result on the ground is that tensions have eased and the dialogue has resumed, and we have not lost sight of the larger picture, which is that we, as two of the largest developing countries, can bring our collective and our shared weight as leading global nations to bring good for the future of the world.
What do you think are the most important factors that prompted the two largest developing economies to pay more attention to the larger picture and bring their relationship on a constructive note?
I think Doklam offered a lesson in many ways. I think we went at least to the brink and we drew back. And I think that was an object lesson about what we need to avoid. Because tensions of this nature, when they escalate or when they happen too frequently, they cast a shadow on the relationship and they reduce mutual trust. And when you have a trust deficit, it doesn't bode well for the relationship. And I think our leaders, Prime Minister Modi and your leader, President Xi, both realized that we cannot afford, as two large Asian countries who have given so much in terms of what an Asian identity means for the world today, to be embroiled, as you said in your question, to be embroiled in such situations. We have differences, we have unresolved problems between our two countries, but that need not stop us from seeking common ground.
What is the Asian identity in today's world? You mentioned this term, and I think it's very interesting. We are different, of course, but collectively, this Asian identity, how do you describe it, and what's the significance of it?
I use a term which is a bit unorthodox. I don't use the word geopolitical or geoeconomic. I always say when it comes to India and China, I borrow this term really from a dear friend, Professor Tan Chung, who is originally from China but spent all his life in India. He speaks about geo-civilizations. And I think we, in a sense, are geo-civilizations. We're not just countries, we are two civilizations who've given much to constructing what an Asian identity is. Of course, our friends, the ASEAN countries, have their distinct identity and are proud of that, and they must also be included in what an Asian identity means. But India and China, as I said, because they're two giant countries with a very rich history between them and individually also as countries, need to be studied and understood much more closely than they have been in the past, to realize what they have contributed to the meaning of Asia, to the idea of Asia, and what this Asian identity signifies as these two countries re-emerge on the global stage. Because if you look at 200 years ago, before the advent of colonialism and before, the domination of the Western powers, our two countries were leading economies. Our GDPs were much larger than those of the West.
Sure.
And we were rich in the real sense of the word, not only materially, but spiritually and also in terms of our cultures.
Well, in terms of strengthening our mutual trust and our mutual understanding, what are some of the things that we have done relatively well between the peoples of our two countries, and what are some of the things that you see are the common challenges we need to work on together?
Yeah. I think the fundamental challenge that we face between India and China is the lack of information about each other. I mean at the level of the common man and woman. We have certain stereotypical views that surface every time we think of each other. And that, I believe, comes from a lack of awareness and a lack of sufficient understanding. Now, you might ask, how can we redress this, or how can we mitigate
Are we
this?
really separated by the Himalayan?
Well, the Himalayas certainly, in a sense, separate us. They kind of define who we are, each of us. But that shouldn't stop us from understanding each other. After all, 2,000 years ago, pilgrims from China came to India, and likewise, Buddhist monks from India went to China. And there was this cross-fertilization of ideas and philosophies and beliefs between the two countries. So we have done this in the past, as the Americans would say, been there, done that. But today, why is it that our young people know so little about each other? If you look at the school curricula in either country, we learn very little about each other. If you look at the movies that are made, we do cover, each other's countries. They surface as themes, but they're very stereotypical treatments, I think. So we need some very, very much of introspection about why we are in that situation, because this lack of awareness and lack of understanding becomes a complication when, you have issues like Doklam, and you saw the way the temperature rose so quickly. Whereas if you had had that deeper understanding, you would draw back from the brink, and you would reflect, and you would act with much more circumspection and maturity.
Yeah. Well, 2006, you were India's ambassador to China. You spent a year there.
I spent almost 3 years here.
Almost 3 years. Excuse my ignorance here. So you saw the China back then, before the Olympic Games, and now it's more than a decade later you come back to China. What are some of the differences that you have observed? And do you think we are doing the right thing in terms of interaction between the two peoples? What can be done better?
Well, when I came here in the autumn of 2006, you were preparing for the Olympics, and I was actually here during the Olympics. And I was also here during the terrible earthquake in Sichuan. And so I witnessed a lot of watershed events while I was here. The first time I came to China, and I can't help but think back at that time. I came in 1986 as a young diplomat.
Wow.
And it was a very different China. As it is true, we were a very different India also then. And I've watched China evolve, and I've watched China's progress, and I've watched China's growth, and it's been phenomenal. And it's certainly, I feel, as an Asian, we must all be happy about the way China has grown in strength and capability.
With the help of Asian countries as well.
But I think it offers an example in some senses, not in all perhaps, because we can also learn from the the shortcomings also, when you think of the atmospheric pollution, when you think of the, what growth has brought in some senses. It's brought progress, it's lifted people out of poverty, which is extremely important, and that's where I think we need to look at China's experience and example. And it has also meant a revival of, what it means for us as Asians to be in the forefront of the world, and that China has shown, and that's a good example, I believe, for a lot of countries to look at. India too is enormously diverse. It's large like China. It's been a democracy for these last 70 years since we've been independent. We've made progress in our own way, in our own fields, and we are accelerating our economic growth. We are lifting people out of poverty, and we are at the same time respectful of our diversity as a people. So I think India's example is also something that the world needs to learn from.
Absolutely, and I think the Chinese need to pay much more attention to our neighbor, which is right next door, and sometimes we tend to look too further away. Now, you worked on a book about China-India relationship that's due out next summer, I understand. It's called Telling It on the Mountain, India and China, 1949 to 1962. What prompted you to write in particular about that period of history? What is the premise, and what do you want to tell people?
Well, I would like to inform the public about the history of that period. And why do I want to do that? First of all, we were newly independent, liberated nations, and we were rediscovering each other. We made a genuine effort to be friends, and we also offered for the rest of the world certain foundational principles that we called the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And as I said, it was a very sincere effort to build a lasting relationship. However, because of our differences relating to the shared border between our two countries, we fell apart and there was conflict. So I believe the progression of events in those years offers a lesson for all of us today. What can we learn from history? Because if we do not learn from history, we are condemned to repeat it, as the saying goes. So my idea was just to inform ordinary people. I don't mean just academia, although I've done a lot of research in the writing of the book, to inform ordinary people in both countries, like, this is what happened, this is what we experienced, and we must learn our lessons from it.
Yeah. Will it be published, will it be translated into Chinese?
I hope so. I hope so. It will be published in India first, and then hopefully I certainly would be open to it being published in China too.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Ambassador Nirupama Menon Rao, former Indian ambassador to China. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.